Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first book talk of 2025. I would like to start by welcoming all of you and thanking you for taking the time to be with us today. Um, Molly Sarone will start shortly by introducing our panelists. Molly is the acquisition editor at Harvard Education Press. Molly, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Mayan. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this Harvard Education Press book talk. As Mayan said, I'm Molly Sarone, an acquisitions editor here at HEP, and I'm delighted to introduce you all to Rick Hess, Michael Horn, and Juliet Squire, who are the co-editors of School Rethink 2.0, putting reinvention into practice. These three co-editors are steeped in the world of school leadership and the future of education, and each brings a unique perspective to the table. Rick Hess is Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He also writes Education Week's popular blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, and is both an executive editor of Education Next and a senior contributor to Forbes. His other influential works on school improvement include Spinning Wheels and Cage Busting Leadership. Michael Horn is a co-founder and a distinguished fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation and teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He co-hosts the top education podcasts Future You and Class Disrupted, and he's the author of several books on the future of education, including From Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Child. And finally, Juliet Squire is a senior partner in the policy and evaluation practice area at Bellwether, where she's studied and written about federal and state policies on charter schools, school governance, private school management organizations, and more. She recently led the Assembly Initiative at Bellwether, working to develop a new framework for how students access individualized learning plans. The volume that they've put together offers a roadmap for educational disruption and reinvention with a fantastic lineup of contributors, including Sal Khan, founder of Khan Academy, Beth Rabbit, CEO of the Learning Accelerator, Larry Berger, CEO of Amplify Education, and many other wonderful educators and leaders and practitioners. It's also an honor today to introduce to you our moderator for the book talk. Please welcome Ebony Lee, who is Chief External Affairs Officer at the Charter School Growth Fund. She's also served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy at the U.S. Department of Education and served for nearly a decade at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now I'll turn it over to Ebony and let her kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you to Harvard for hosting this conversation today, and thank you to my authors today. So we're just going to jump right in. So Rick, Michael, and Julie, put your seatbelt on. We're talking about rethinking school, something I'm a little familiar with, but how did this particular book come about? And what do you mean when you say the great school rethink anyway?
So I think this book came about a couple of years ago. I wrote a book called The Great School Rethink for Harvard. I'd been in some conversations with a terrific team at Harvard Ed Press during the pandemic, and so many of my usual hobby horses. What are we actually doing with time in school? What's the right way to think about technology? What's the right way to think about staff? Loomed larger than ever as we were thinking about how do we actually not only get kids back where they need to be, but actually think about where do we go from here. During that, Michael had written his terrific book, From Reopen to Reinvent, and we were doing a podcast together. I think we got into a conversation, and we said, I think I tend to be highly aware. Michael's closer to doing the work than I am. I tend to be highly aware that I have lots of interesting interviews and anecdotes and metaphors. But when we're out there talking about how do you actually do the work of rethinking or reinventing, I'm the last guy who's actually done it. I hang out on the fifth floor of a DC office building. But there are people out there who Michael and Julie and I know who spend all day, every day, up to their elbows in this work. What are opportunities to really rethink the student experience, to rethink what it means to be a teacher, to rethink how we use assessment? And they spend all day, every day trying to actually figure out the solution, figure out what it looks like to do that solution in real schools with real kids and in real communities, and then make that and then work their way through all of the hurdles and politics and the rest. And Michael and I started talking about, wouldn't it be great if we got a bunch of these people who have all of this hard-earned wisdom that usually is locked up in their heads and got them to share it and talk about the real work and the real stuff. And we needed somebody who actually does all this back and forth. And, Julie and I have worked together, over the last 20 years. And so we begged Julie to come in and help us make this happen. And that's how the book came about.
Awesome. So you kind of got the who's who in what I like to term the kind of education glitterati to write chapters for this. So can you guys tell me a little bit about how you chose them and how these pieces fit together? Michael, you're smiling. We'll
Yeah,
give you
well,
first crack.
I love the way you just phrased it of the education glitterati, as you said. But we really wanted a set of perspectives, right, that touched all these different themes that Rick just touched on. How to use time, how to use talent, right? How to use technology. None of those things for their own sake or because it's how we've always done it, but a real rethinking attitude with student outcomes in mind. And so we, like you said, we thought about who are not just the glitterati because they're glittery, but because they've actually been in schools doing things, right? And so Sal Khan and his team, right? It's not just Sal who wrote the chapter, it's his team that's actually been busy rolling up their sleeves with districts. Scott Ellis on the Mastery Learning, he got his roots in the Learning Accelerator working with district schools, but we really wanted to know the brass tacks of what it looks like when he's implemented with teachers. Same thing with Beth and her team at the Learning Accelerator. Personalized learning is one of the biggest buzz phrases that I think drives all of us nuts. But they really have been thoughtful about how do you personalize and toward what end? Like, why are you trying to do this? And so to get those insights, I think no one better than Brent Madden to think about the use of talent right out there. As you think about choice and how schools are built, Mike McShane, Adam Peshek are obviously on the bleeding edge of those conversations. And then I guess this last part around sort of a little bit more structural, right? Corey Moan, a lot of people are rethinking sort of the college for all at any cost goals. He's thinking a lot about career technical education. How do you think about a movement there, right? And then Joel and Larry Berger, of course, really in the guts of curriculum, and Art Vanderveen really in the guts of assessment, which helps define the why and what are kids actually doing on a day-to-day basis. And they're great at exposing things that, like Larry's chapter on changing core curriculum, you're just like, well, why can't this happen? And then you realize all these barriers to adoption and how you work with districts and what that compels the supplier to look like and all the things that they have to check. And you're like, holy cow, it's a miracle anyone rethinks this. And yet he got through it, right? And so these are great case studies, I think, throughout.
I love that. So Julie, Rick touched on this at the beginning a little bit, but I'm really curious, like this kind of emerged over the pandemic, but why did you guys feel like this was the moment? Like why now? And obviously, you guys have an incredible power of persuasion to get all of these people to say yes, but humor me. Like why now? What is so urgent about this moment that you decided that this was the time for this particular volume?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a few different things. One is the moment of the pandemic and the disruption that wrought on school systems and the opportunity that disruption can sometimes bring to challenge, what we all sort of refer to as the grammar of schooling, the structures, the systems, the routines that are so common that it's hard to almost see them. They're so ubiquitous. And the pandemic really forced change in a very short period of time. And so sort of thinking about what we could learn from that, some of the changes that were able to be made in the midst of the pandemic that we might have otherwise thought were impossible to do. And so sort of thinking about what's possible in that context. But I think there's also another case, another timeline that's important to think about, which is relevant to the NAEP scores that just came out, right? Before the pandemic, even the year before the pandemic, those scores were already starting to tick downwards. And now we've seen another tick downwards. And I think in the decades sort of leading up to 2020, it was really easy to sort of celebrate those small incremental improvements. And since they've gone down, it's been really easy to bemoan their decline, and really easy to forget that whatever those changes are, they've been very incremental. And we need transformative change in education in order to build a system that meets the needs for all kids.
Love that. And I think this word transformative gets tossed out a lot. And you just brought up NAEP, and I think we all kind of had a feeling, a sense of foreboding, if you will, that the slide would continue. And I think all of our worst fears were realized. But this all brings up a very hot topic, which you cover in depth in the book, around assessment. And there's this notion that assessments need to shift from helping students to learn versus where we are now, where it's assessing where students are. How do you guys feel about that? And what did the authors have to say about this notion of assessment should help students learn? Because clearly they haven't mastered what we thought they would have.
Julie, you're in the weeds on this. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me in reading through Arthur's chapter and the work that he's doing at New Meridian is how much we ask assessments to do. We want them to be formative and inform instruction, but we also want them to be a summative, and we want them to, help teachers decide what students need to have in their next lesson, but we also want them to feed into state report cards and accountability systems. And I think one of the things that really struck me in reading that chapter is how hard it is for us as a field to really anchor on the things where we have the greatest levers for change without looking for a perfect solution, because there are always going to be trade-offs. Whatever the assessment system is, there will be trade-offs of what it can and cannot do well. And then it also takes me back to thinking about work that's been done in the sector to look at all of the ways in which students are assessed in exit tickets and pop quizzes and unit tests, plus formative, plus summative, and think about all of the time as a system we ask students to spend taking tests and how the goals of those tests overlap with each other and are in some ways duplicative. So I think this really begs the question of how we think about assessment, what the various purposes of assessment are, and then how do you get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of how you want to spend students' time, and really forcing the conversations around hard decisions that do have trade-offs, and recognizing there's no one set of assessments or one solution for assessments that's going to hit every single mark that needs to be hit.
Ebony, if I can just piggyback on Julie there for a sec. I mean, I think one of the things what Julie just said really illustrates is a lot of times when people who are actually in classrooms and in schools start to hear this conversation, they're like, there go those DC people and those foundation people again, having their like up high talk. And when those of us who spend a lot of time, on the coast start talking about this, it's all about here's the levers we need to drop on school. And one of the things that I think is really cool about this work, about the rethinking, the reinvention, and especially when you read the contributors, is it's not one or the other of those. These big conversations we have about formative instruction, that's great. But if it's going to take you 8 to 12 weeks to actually get the assessment data in the hands of the educators, it doesn't matter what you thought you were doing, you ain't helping. And if you're doing summative assessments, but it's going to take 8 or 10 hours of assessment to get these numbers, and schools are going to dive deep in test prep, and you're not going to get the actual results until well into the next academic year, well, it doesn't matter how clever your accountability system is. It's breaking down where, rubber meets road. And so for me, what's so powerful about reading, these guys in this book is they're all about rubber meets road, which is a great way to get us out of our policy talk or practitioners talking to each other. And it's more, how do we talk across some of these divides where we get so frustrated?
I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of where the rubber meets the road. And I think it was in maybe Larry's chapter where he talked about kind of big EDU. Like, will big EDU let this happen, right? Will they let good actually emerge from this and not be so focused on the perfect so that we can give real-time feedback for teachers to adjust their practice? Like, or is this really a pie in the sky? Like, can we get to a place where assessments are just good enough and timely enough to do what we need them to do? What do you guys think?
I think, interestingly enough, just to sort of answer that question and also jump off where Rick and Julie were talking about, is we're at a point where the obstacle is not technology, right? Facilitating that per se. The obstacle is all the systems that Rick was just referencing in terms of like our inability to wrestle with trade-offs or our inability to think through, sort of like, yes, it's not going to be a gold standard, this on that dimension. And therefore are we willing to wait 8 to 10 weeks, or are we willing to get something now? Right. Like, these are all trade-offs and questions we have to confront. And so, but the obstacles aren't technology anymore, right? We can have assessment that is giving immediate feedback, forget to the teacher, right to the student themselves, so that they can get immediate feedback. And that's like one of the ironies that I've always found about this conversation we've been in for, frankly, a quarter century now, which is striking, is like we've been talking about data-driven decision-making in education and failing to acknowledge that when you give data, after the fact, as Rick was saying, into the next year in many cases, with no ability to act on it, it's the opposite of motivating or allow someone to take an action. It's demotivating. It just labels you all the things that we supposedly hate, like it does right now. But we can break that trade-off right now at the moment. And so I think that's a conversation we have to have in sort of real time. And to Julie's point, which part of this are we going to sacrifice? And I'll just sort of finish there. One of the things that struck me about arts, what they're doing at New Meridian is they have content aligned assessments, right? In Louisiana, Montana, some other places like that. And so you're actually assessing, did the kid, what they were working on, did they make progress against it? There's some comparability issues that result from that, right? It's kind of hard to say, did they learn as much as someone else who was doing a different curriculum? Is that a trade-off we're willing to make or not? Like, these are conversations we have to have at some level. But I don't know, personally, I find art's, approach so refreshing because it starts from the classroom up as opposed to the top down.
Oh, Michael, you just hit on so many themes, so many directions that I want to go in. So I'm going to take this one at a time. So let's just start with the tech piece, right? So technology is no longer the barrier, you said. And so enter AI, right? And the rise of AI. And there's a wonderful chapter there. And, AI is, the second coming, right? So it's going to help teachers save time. It's going to enable them to do what teachers do best. How important is AI or technology to this whole rethinking of schools, right? Like, does it hinge on it? If it doesn't turn out to be the second coming, do we put the rethink on the shelf? How important is AI?
I'll give my 30. I was gonna say, let me give my 30-second answer, and then let me make way for the others. Which is what I would say is that AI, as Rick's colleague John Bailey says, yes, it's different in some big important ways, but at the end of the day, it is a technology. And what is really important is the systems and models we put around the technology and how we use it. Like, technology is always a terrible master. It's a very helpful tool. And so that relies on the structures and decisions human beings make around it, in my view. And if we ever think technology is a panacea, we have missed the boat, in my view. It's like, how are we using it? Are we cramming it in the existing model to spit out, test results ex post facto, like an autopsy 10 weeks later? Okay, that's one thing. Or are we using it in very different models that informs instruction immediately? Well, that's not how our schools are set up right now either, right? And so we really need to be clear about models, processes, and so forth, as opposed to just like technology, stir, drop in, and somehow like we get a beautiful concoction out of that.
Yeah, that's well said. What I'll do is for me, when folks want to talk about the power of technology, it seems to me that at the end of the day, teaching and learning are fundamentally, inescapably human acts. And, we saw this, that this became brutally clear during the pandemic. When you have teachers teaching 25 kids with their cameras off, muted, nobody's learning a damn thing. You've got kids who are busy on social media, distracted. You've got teachers who are saying words, nothing's getting absorbed. Because teaching and learning are not about saying things or about like opening an app. Teaching and learning are about connection. They're about mastering knowledge. They're about discovering ideas. So technology, I think, is going to deliver in schooling to the extent that it makes schooling fundamentally more human, which means I am hugely concerned about how we're thinking about using AI in schools. If we're using AI so that special education teachers are spending half as much time figuring out paperwork, and which means they have a lot more time to actually diagnose and instruct and support kids, that's fantastic. When teachers are using AI to write their IEPs, that's a huge problem because AI doesn't actually understand learning disability. What it is it's a word prediction engine. And so what it's doing is it's writing IEPs that look like other IEPs it has found out there. Well, that's not understanding a learner. Look, we had this problem in the 1970s when we first brought calculators into schools. There was this holy war between folks who were excited. Good, kids got calculators. They don't have to learn. They don't have to learn fundamentals anymore. Forget addition, forget division. They got the calculator. And there was the other school of thought, which was let's burn all the calculators. It's a threat. The education community tended to embrace the calculators are great, knowledge is yesterday's news. And what turned out was it turned out to be devastatingly bad for kids because if you don't master the basics of computation, you're suddenly at sea when things start to get more complicated. So over time, we learned kids still need to learn all of those computation fundamentals, but once they do, the calculator can be a huge time saver, which means more time for learning, more time for interaction when you start to get up to algebra and geometry and trigonometry. Well, when we think about what teachers are doing with AI, when you think about people who are excited about AI tutors, kids sitting there and having conversations with their AI, some of this is going to support and extend real meaningful learning, but a lot of it is just a facsimile of learning. It's no different than kids sitting and playing Halo or playing Madden for 4 or 5 hours. It's not actually mastering content. It's not actually developing understanding. It's not actually developing ability to connect or understand other human beings. So what's it look like to get AI or tech right? Whether this stuff is as profound as some hope or not, it's always going to be how are we actually integrating it into the real lives of teachers and learners?
Julie, I don't know if you, okay.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything Michael and Rick have said, which is I think put a finer point on a distinction that I think Rick is making between AI and classrooms and how AI interacts with kids and AI being used at the system level. And I think those are two very different use cases that need different guardrails and different applications. The other thing I think is interesting to consider is, when we think about an AI tutor, for instance, it's what's the comparison point? AI tutor versus what? Versus nothing? Versus a human tutor? Versus an effective classroom teacher? And so thinking a little bit about what are the ways in which AI in interacting with kids is a value add and for whom? What are the other ways to meet those students' needs? And I think there's an international component to this as well. And I'm by no means an expert in comparative education, but it strikes me that we are seeing a revolution in sort of the knowledge marketplace that may affect us less than other countries, but we're going to have to be at a society level ready to be responsive and competitive with other organizations, other nations that are using this in other ways.
So you guys have sparked another kind of facet of the book in talking about the technology piece. Obviously, the technology doesn't quite run itself. You need a co-conspirator with the teachers. And what we found in some of the teacher chapters is that they are, at best unfamiliar with the technology, but certainly not confident in the technology, inexperienced, and cite like other pressures in their kind of teaching duties, whether it's keeping up with a pacing guide. How should we be preparing teachers? Are they being prepared? Like, what's the shift that needs to take place in the classroom with the teacher in order to enable technology? And should it just be the teacher? Because maybe it's not just a teacher, it's multiple teachers, because we also hear the teachers love to collaborate, right? So is this, hey, we've got to train you better to use the technology, or is it you just need to get together with a few of your colleagues and things will get better? So how do we bring teachers into this? Michael, you're smiling.
Well, because I think you're asking the right question, right? And you're asking in the right way, which is one of the assumptions we've always had is there's one teacher, there's many students, and that teacher somehow is a superhero and has all these magical, mystical powers that extend beyond curriculum instruction, classroom management, et cetera, right? To all the other things you just started alluding to being an expert in every single new thing that's coming along. And one of the reasons I love the chapter that Brent Madden wrote is it fundamentally questions that assumption and says, well, what does it look like if we have a team of teachers? And I don't mean like the A team where your social studies teacher and your science teacher meet, once a week over lunch to talk about Michael's problems, but instead are actively co-teaching together. And all of a sudden, what does that enable you to do? And there's no one size fits all answer on this, right? And he brings that to light in his chapter. This is dependent upon the human capital and the talents that you have available. It's dependent upon, everything from licensure and certifications to what skills does someone locally bring, right? Someone who is a deep expert in physics might not actually know how to hold a classroom, but someone alongside of them all of a sudden says, hey, 50 kids with your expertise, that's not that many. What can we do together, right? I'll go deep on the assessment and the AI and things like that. You be the content expert. Together, we're going to be a really powerful force. And I think that's the really cool thing is you can imagine with co-teaching models, a really varied landscape for how classrooms start to look and work and things of that nature that really draw from the local context and the talent that's there in some pretty neat ways. So I think their work questioning those assumptions, but also showing how it's played out in many different settings, because they're at Arizona State University, but they're not just writing about it. They're actually actively working with districts to implement is really exciting. And I hope we leave with, 10, 15 models from it, right? That people can start to figure out, okay, how do I adapt this to my local context?
In Ebony, I mean, we're at Harvard Ed, your point about teacher prep, for instance, right? There's a chicken and egg problem. If folks aren't trained, not just for different roles in terms of content, but in terms of the role, the organization, mentoring, if nobody's trained for it, it's hard for schools to find anybody to do it. But if there aren't any schools where you actually leverage those skills, then there's no reason for, to train teachers for jobs which don't exist. So it's got to be, so there's a chicken and egg dimension. And one of the great things that Brent is able to talk about is how they have tried to kind of raise chicken and egg together. Ed School in partnership with school districts. So you've got both sites that can use those teachers with those skills and somebody who's training the teachers for that work. That's the kind of boundary crossing that, again, that we need, but that we have too often not been able to pull off.
Julie, do you have anything you want to add?
I think they've covered it.
Awesome. Okay. So I think this notion of boundary crossing that Rick just talked about is something that rears its head a lot and keeps us in the one teacher, 25 students classroom model. And so much of this volume is focused on, are there new models or different ways of delivering education that don't require that? So we talked about AI, we talked about the classroom configuration. Let's talk about the actual school model. So we have a whole chapter on choice, right? And what choice means. Again, my opinion, I think I get to do that as moderator. Choice is kind of like here to stay. Post-pandemic, choice is here, right? And are people just not comfortable with parents making decisions without kind of expert input? Because there's still a resistance, even though it's here to stay. Like, what makes people so uncomfortable with this notion of choice? I feel like, Rick, you could probably spend the next 30 minutes on it, but you only get a couple.
Yeah, and actually, I really want to hear Julie, because Julie's written a lot, for instance, about
Mhm.
efforts to support and provide parents with some scaffolding around this.
Mhm.
Look, I mean, I think, partly this is why rethinking is such a useful construct, because we tend to talk about choice is, are you for public schools or against them? Are they failing, or are they, well, I mean, it's clear that we're doing an abysmal job by all of our kids. And if you look across district schools, charter schools, private schools, nobody is getting kids consistently where we want them to be. Um, but I think what we've seen come out over the last 20, 30 years, and what's been turbocharged by the pandemic, is it used to be that just the mechanics of getting your kid to a different school were really hard because of transportation barriers. Used to be that the act of getting information on a school and the act of communicating with different schools was tough, just because you had to pick up the yellow phone mounted on your kitchen wall in 1985. Like today, between transportation, between communication, between informational advances, the world, it allows a much higher degree of kind of flexibility, allows people to have a school experience, which is partly in a building, but also partly kind of courses chosen and delivered online. There's new ways to kind of put together what it means to be in a school. We've seen that with micro schools, for instance. So it's not just that the pandemic made a lot of people say, hey, I feel like I need more power over where my kid's going, but also the boundaries, definition of what it means to be a school have just fundamentally started to morph over the last 40 years. And Julie, I mean, you've spent a lot of time. How do you help parents start
Yeah.
to navigate that changing world?
Yeah, it's such a huge topic and interest. But I mean, I think first, Ebony, I think you're absolutely right. Choice isn't going anywhere, because I think what people fail sometimes to recognize is that if we were actually to eliminate choice from the education system, we would not only have to like close all private schools, all micro schools, etc. We would also have to assign people where they live, because choice is embedded in the education system by where people choose to buy homes based on the district or the school that their child will be enrolled in, all the way through opting out of the public system for private school choice. And so I think when we think about choice, we have to think about the full spectrum of choice, which goes all the way back to housing. Second, and to follow up on Rick, your point, I think there is a lot of questioning of the right balance between, parents' decision making and parents' sort of quote unquote expertise about education. And I think, in the work that I've done on the kinds of support parents are looking for, it's that they really need to understand what options are available to them. And they often also want help from people who really understand teaching and learning to help them make decisions about what's best for their kids. And so I think there's sort of a false dichotomy in the conversation right now around sort of who has the expertise. And the reality is it's a balance. The parents know their children best. They know what gets their children excited. They know if they're geeking out over Tonka trucks or dinosaurs or whatever it is, and how their learning might riff off of that. But they also really do appreciate and want the expertise of those who've trained to be educators. And so I think it's important to find ways in the choice ecosystem to allow both of those things to work in concert. And that goes into this question of navigation and the kinds of support parents need when they are trying to make sense of an increasingly complex ecosystem of options, which are now not just, as Rick said, at the level of a school as sort of the unit of consumption, but much broader than that. After school programs, tutoring, sports, all of those support the growth and development of a child, and we have to be thinking about them holistically when we think about the choices parents make.
Michael, I see you nodding. Do you want to add on to this? Because I have a follow-up question.
I'm going to say
And that
amen.
is-
I'm going to say amen and let you go. Yeah.
Awesome. So Julie brought up like this process of navigation, right? And that, choice isn't binary. It isn't an either or, that there are a plethora of choices. And when we think about where we want to go next, because it isn't going anywhere, the next question that naturally comes up is, well, is this micro school scalable, right? Or can every parent homeschool? And so when you think about choice and this broader conversation about rethinking schooling, where does scale fit, right? Does this change need to happen from the top down? Does it need to be bottom up? Does it matter?
Yeah,
Michael?
I'll jump in there because something that we wrote in the toward the end of the book in the conclusion is that maybe we've thought of scale as this sort of software model of scale has been grossly misfit for the world of education. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when we talk about scale, again, in the conversations that Rick parodies in Washington, D.C., is like we find the school that works and we hit copy paste a billion times and all of a sudden we've solved education. And that's a very best practices mindset. But the reality is the contexts of kids, of communities, of what anyone needs in different regional clusters are like very different along all those axes, right? And so what I think the argument is that a better way to think about scale is like civil engineering, which is to say that the laws of physics do not change whether you're in San Francisco or snowy Boston where I am. But because the terrain is different, how you build a bridge is vastly different by using those principles, right? And so, earthquake San Francisco, snowy Boston, two totally different contexts. The landscape and what we build is totally different as a result. Physics didn't change. And so I think that's a lot of how we think about scale here is there's certain principles, sure, that scale, and they come through, I think, in a lot of these chapters. But the trade-offs you make, what you choose to do in your individual circumstance is going to vary based on your needs and your local context. And so in some ways, the micro school conversation is not a, will this one micro school that seems to be awesome for this one community, are we going to make that scale? But instead, are we going to allow lots of educators to be entrepreneurs, to create principles from that, and then create their own versions of micro schools that serve their community, or frankly, alter it for different needs? Are we going to enable a world like that? That's fundamentally a bottoms-up world, to answer your question. That is not a top-down world. None of us are smart enough to imagine how to handle every single differentiated use case that you could possibly need to construct. Nor should we want to be. Like, that's a scary world to think about, sort of that, all-knowing perspective.
Love to hear you guys riff off that a little bit, because it's scary as it may seem. I do think some of Rick's friends in DC love to play that role. So any
Ebony, our
contrary
friends,
opinions?
our friends,
Our friends? Oh,
our
okay,
friends.
know.
Look, let me, if it's okay, let me just flip the question on its head a bit, because I think folks out there who are educators or work in communities, their reaction to a lot of this might be, oh man, this is that innovation stuff again. It's all of you guys dreaming up your innovations. And the one thing I think that Julie and Michael and I really try to be clear about in this book is that we hate innovation. We are anti-innovation. This is not innovation. And there's a big mistake that tends to get made in education. You never walk into like an Apple store and hear anybody say, "Can I buy your most innovative iPhone?" I mean, if you hear somebody say that, everybody who works there is rolling their eyes, because it's just a dumb request. We don't buy innovative things. You buy a phone that has more capacity, that has this functionality, has a better camera. You don't want a phone that's innovative. Yet in education, we have innovation awards, innovative schools, innovative zones, and everybody gets all excited about the innovate. And what they're doing is they are completely mistaking the cart for the horse. If you are telling me that there is a problem with student engagement or student discipline, or that we're not able to teach we're doing a terrible job teaching Algebra 1. What we want to do is solve that problem. And we shouldn't actually care if the solution is new or old. We should care whether the solution is good for kids and actually is practical for teachers in classrooms. That's what the folks who contribute to this book are interested in. They're interested in what's the problem, how do we solve it? And I worry that when people start to have this conversation, they lose sight of that incredibly practical, let's do it thing. And they start talking about what's innovative, what's different. And then we're back with our friends in Washington, D.C. and at West Coast Philanthropies and at like fancy universities doing stuff because it sounds interesting and novel, not because it solves a specific problem for kids.
Just to jump off there, Ebony, because I think people, if they know me, they're probably surprised to hear Rick say that we agree on this, because I think my brand is the innovation guy. But just to state it, like, to me, innovation, it's only innovative if it actually helps you make progress against a problem you're trying to solve. And so the reason I agree completely with what the substance of what Rick just said is what I think is that we often just look for the innovative thing because it's different. And I can't tell you the number of times people have asked me, what's the most innovative school out there? And I'm like, I mean, innovation is relative. Like, did it help this school make progress toward meeting the needs of these kids? So I don't care that it's been done elsewhere before. If it was new for them, then that's innovative because it helped them make progress against a problem. So too, this group, student group, a few years back out of Stanford, they were like, what's the criteria for innovative schools, right? And I was like, why don't you choose the outcome measures you're interested in and just measure that? Because like, I like, the process is going to look different in different places. And what's innovative in one place, maybe not innovative in another because they've always done it. I like, who am I to judge that? But are they making progress for the students that they're serving? That's the question that I'm ultimately interested in. And against that backdrop, innovation is a means, it is not the ends.
I think that's exactly right. And to bring it back to scale, Ebony, where you pointed us at first, is that the innovation is not what scales, it's the process of innovation that scales. And I think that's something that shows up in every single chapter of this volume, is that these are leaders who are iterating, they are trying stuff, they're saying, oh, choose your 4-letter word, that didn't work, let me try again. They are constantly tweaking. And I think that's something that the education sector and those sort of really married to the definition of innovation as being the new bright shiny thing lose out on, is that this is a learning and this is a learning process, it's an iterative process, and that's what needs to be scaled, not the particular solution that emerges in response to a particular problem.
And by the way, what we hope our kids will do, right, as they learn.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Like, we're modeling it for them ideally. And that also means sunsetting what doesn't work, which is not something we do particularly well in education.
I love that. All right, I know we need to shift to some questions from our listeners, but I'm going to ask you this one last question while I scan the Q&A. And this is really focused on this notion of, like, are we making progress? Are we solving problems? Are the kids getting better? And there are sections of the volume that are focused on this notion around, everybody has a word for it, whether it's competency-based learning, whether it's proficiency-based learning, whether it's mastery. Where does that fit in the rethinking, right? Like, we can, the notion is that progress is assessed in real time, right? And then we move on, as opposed to waiting a full school year to figure out if kids learn things. And it enables or empowers the educator to treat, right? To redirect, to reteach if need be, and not wait until the end. And yet it still feels like this is a concept that faces a lot of resistance. And so when do we get to really shift this paradigm around 180 days, age and grade, into mastery? Solve the problem or treat the problem and move on.
I'm going to try to channel Rick here as I answer the question, but I think
I love
part of the
this.
challenge Well, because right, like I read a lot about mastery based or competency. I don't care what you call it. But to your point, right? But I think what it requires up front is the people who are doing it to have agreement on what is the learning we're looking for and how would we know. And everyone always wants to skip past that stage, right? And so I think until you can have agreement, and I don't know that it has to be master agreement, but in the communities that we're doing it, you have to have agreement on what's the learning objective and how would we know that they have in fact learned it. And I think that's the conversation. I'd be curious, Julie and Rick, your takes on this. To me, that's the conversation like we consistently overlook when we move into that into that conversation.
Yeah, and I think I think Michael's 100% right. Um, Look, and I partly it's because it's uncomfortable. I think one of the reasons why a lot of the talk around competency, mastery based, winds up feeling 21st century skills-ish is because, it's soft. It's kind of we don't have to get too precise. And this is one of the mistakes, I think, in education where we tend to label all of the hard conversations as like culture stuff, culture war. And we don't want to go there. But look, we have to decide, do kids have to master computation or not? Is that essential? If so, then that's got to be part of that fundamental scaffolding of mastery. Do they need to know Algebra 1? When do they need to know it? Do they need to know kind of Don Hirsch's kind of cultural literacy building blocks in terms of literature and history? I believe they absolutely do. But we've got to just honestly kind of hash that stuff out because if you're trying to get cute and do competency or mastery based learning, like Michael said, before you've hashed that out, you're asking for trouble.
Just super quick, and then Julie, I want like you to get in there on that. I think there's also another possibility, right? Which is there's certain things that we say, like this is core. We want kids to learn computation, or we want them to know the facts of the United States, right? Like, 100 senators, right? 435 House of Representatives. Like we want them to know how these things work, this knowledge, or how to apply it, or things of that nature. And I think it's also possible, like there are things of E.D. Hirsch's, core, right? That we like in a community say like, that'd be awesome if they know it. This is how we'd measure it. But like, not every kid needs to learn it. And so we will show mastery if a kid does, but we're not going to represent that they did if they didn't, right? So what I mean by that is like, my kid might, get an incomplete if they started it or a not started. So like, we're not signaling something that is not real. That's the other part. I think you can branch out and have choice even in that landscape, but we have to be real about what does it mean to have done that? How would we know? And like, we're either going to be super ironclad, you keep working at this, or at some level, we're going to be like, you didn't get it. And that's, like, we just got to be honest. You didn't get it.
And but maybe but to your point, Michael, hashing it out might mean that's right, saying that there's different avenues that we're going to regard as, satisfactory. And
That's right.
but I think there's been a studied discomfort with this. So instead of kind of Michael's kind of like just being like, look, let's be honest with each other and with the students, we kind of use some of this as a way to avoid the uncomfortable stuff.
Agreed.
I agree with all of that. I would just add maybe two additional flavors. One is, I think as we think about branching off in terms of what we assess and how we assess it, I think, this is where education pluralism, I think, becomes a really important concept. As kids get older, they are going to concentrate in different things. They're going to have different areas of specialty, and I think we have to be comfortable with that. And I think it also means that there's a mindset we have to be teaching alongside those opportunities to learn one thing but not another, which is curiosity. So that when kids get older and they are in the workforce and they are operating in society, they are not so anchored to what they particularly learned as being important that they are not also curious about what a student learned who chose a different path, and they actually have that opportunity and the inclination to learn from one another. And then the second thing I would add slightly on a more tactical note is I think competency-based education in general becomes much more important when you think about sort of the unbundled world of learning. And that doesn't just mean like taking a school and unbundling what a school provides. It also means appreciating what students are learning outside of school through after school programs from their tutors, etc. So that if a child is really into dance and is spending multiple hours a day dancing, they don't also have to take PE in school. Those kinds of things, so that we're not duplicating effort inside and outside of school, but can have a competency-based structure that actually allows kids to demonstrate what they've learned in any context and have that be appreciated and valued by the systems that they're going through.
That's really good. I want to keep going, but I also want to be respectful of the questions that everyone has submitted. And so some of these came in earlier. My apologies for not tracking with this. So we'll go back a little bit on AI. And I thought this was a really interesting question. It says, how can we as teachers and parents nurture in students that they are, as a unique human individual, will always be better than AI?
I do think it goes a little bit to what Rick was saying about how AI in fact works, right? Which is that it's a predictive engine. And now, granted, they've built in reasoning, meaning that it can iterate on itself, right? And check, so it can improve. But the reality is it's still converging in its thinking. It's not right. It's built on an average at some level. It's not diverging. And so that's how individuals, I think, are different. And I think the second part, I wrote this piece recently of like, a lot of people are being really lazy about right now around what skills will be sacrosanct in the future. They say like humans will always be better at communicating and listening than AI. I don't know about you, like most human beings, that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment.
New friends, Michael.
Right. So what does that mean, right? And I think it's like, okay, how do we use AI as a tool so that we can practice at the thing that we get really geeked out on and like want to go deep where we add value, right? I think we're all sort of struggling with that right now and learning what's right for us against that backdrop. But that's the other part of it, is like, how does it complement you as a tool, not like this sort of replace conversation that I think has never been a real thing throughout human history. Like, yes, we have replacing of jobs, but it's because then we augment, right, in the totality. And I think that's generally the story of how humans and technology have interacted. I expect it to be the same ultimately here.
Awesome. All right, we're going to get to a couple more. So my next question says, my question is from a parent's perspective. I completely understand that teachers are trying, and they are not superheroes, of course. Keeping that in mind, parents like me feel hesitant to bring up concerns, worrying about being seen as difficult parents. I love this. What's your advice for parents, like how to engage and share your concerns about progress?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a two-way street. First off, I mean, if schools are making parents feel unwelcome, like feedback or concerns are going to be held against the child, that is a brutal problem. And that's one of the reasons why I believe it's crucial to empower parents. If you're stuck in a school like that, your hands as a parent are really tied. But I don't think that's most schools. I don't think that's even a significant chunk of schools. In my experience, most educators, most school leaders want to engage productively. But keep in mind that a lot of people don't have good kind of emotional intelligence when they reach out. When their kid's getting disciplined, when they're frustrated about something, they lash out at the school. They'll send really angry emails. They'll storm into the receptionist's kind of. So one of the ways to kind of invite schools to engage with you is to make sure you're signaling that you want to productively figure out what's going on with your kid or classroom rather than that you want to vent. So what's that look like? It means try to be real concrete in explaining what the concern is. It means framing it in terms of like, look, I know that there's a lot of stuff going on. I realize you've got other things on your plate. It means being persistent about making sure you get a response. But if it takes a day or two or a second email, not immediately going volcanic. I think most teachers and most principals will respond most of the time productively if you reach out in that way. But a lot of parents, justifiably, all of us are so worried about our kids that we don't always kind of make sure we reach out productively.
Awesome. All right, I think this is going to be our final question from the audience. Victoria asks, many low-income students don't have access to great teachers or well-funded schools, which often forces them to rely heavily on the internet and AI tools for learning. So given this reality, how do you see AI being used to bridge educational gaps and supplement learning experiences for these students? And how can we ensure all students can competently use AI?
I mean, I think this sort of, I'm curious to know, Michael, what you would say on this in particular, but I think this sort of goes back to this question of AI in comparison to what? Because there are students for whom access to a high quality in-person human tutor is not going to be available. And I think some of the work that's been done to try to scale high impact tutoring has borne that out. And so in the absence of better solutions, when does AI come to the fore? And so I do think it's important to wrestle with the role of AI in by no means the expert on this call in disruptive innovation, but in like an innovation that is serving the margin of a market in a way that isn't being served already. And so something that is less than perfect is actually better than nothing. And so I do think it's a really good and important question. I think, I suspect and hope that AI tools will become more universally accessible to students in the same way we had a digital divide with internet connectivity and devices, that some AI tools will follow that path. And I think it is going to require a lot of instruction for students and guardrails for systems in terms of how to use AI safely and responsibly. Because there are certainly some risks attached. And we spent a lot of time talking about the upside of AI and how much potential there is for upside. And I think we also need to have a similar conversation about what the potential downsides are so that we are preparing students to not just take advantage of it, but also mitigate the risks.
I'll give maybe 30 seconds since you called on me, but I agree with everything you said. And to that end, I think it comes back to what's the outcome we're really looking for. And in many cases, I think that's going to require us to realize it's not the brand new shiny paper that AI wrote 90% of, but it's more the process, right, of how you wrote the paper and like sort of arguing with yourself to develop your thinking strand and bringing in knowledge. And AI is a bit of a, it's a tutor there to help push your thinking or ask questions. But like, I'm not actually interested as the teacher in the bright, shiny thing, but that requires me to have clarity about what am I actually looking for and how am I assessing it? If it's not the performance, it's the process.
Love that. So we are coming up at the conclusion of our hour. So I'm going to ask one final question and ask you to respond with one word. I know this will be difficult. What do you want readers of this book to take away? You want them to take away some inspiration, maybe a little instruction, maybe you feel under indictment. So what is it, one word that you want folks to take away from the book?
Can I have 4 words?
Go for it, Rick.
We can solve problems.
Love it.
I was going to say reflective, like don't be knee jerk.
I would say I'll take 2 words. Keep trying.
Love it. Well, thank you all very much. And I will turn it back over.
Thank you, Ebony.
Thank you, everyone.